Well,
All
here we
right. Well, good morning, Miss Chelsea.
Katie.
Thanks for joining us.
Always happy to.
Happy to be back, especially after last month's Ag Issues webinar talked about water, and that tended to be one of the more popular ones we've had here in just a little while. So I know I'm very much looking forward to today, kind of doing a recap of what just happened with that crazy election. And more importantly, how is that going to affect what Farm Bureau and our farmers and ranchers are going to be doing sort of in these next sessions? What are the concerns? What are the priorities? That sort of thing. So thank you again for being with us.
Well, happy to be here. And, I think what just happened is, in fact, the question that a lot of us were asking at the beginning of November, especially. So happy to walk through some of it with you. And like you said, what are the actual implications of that? And actually, we're going to do a little bit of a water update too, because there were some water related election news that we'll share. So let's jump right in. You ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So on the what just happened, this is where we are. Unless you've kind of been under a rock, which, you know what, it's the holidays, so I don't blame you if you have been under a rock for a little bit. You will know that we've had quite a bit of turnover and different than expected outcomes from the November election. So we, for the first time in many, many years, have a Democrat governor. Her name is Katie Hobbs, currently serving as our Secretary of State, will take over as governor in January. Fun fact, Katie, which state in the United States has the most female governors?
Oh, I think it's us.
That's us. This is
Yeah.
number five.
Yeah.
Number five, which it's probably my favorite fun fact about the state, to be perfectly honest. But it was going to be a female either way, right? Because she was running against a female. But female governor number five, go Arizona. Absolutely love the girl power. Let's keep it up. Secretary of State also flipped from a Republican to a Democrat in Adrian Fontes. If you were familiar with the other person running in that race, his name was Mark Fincham. As a former legislator, Adrian Fontes is actually an elections official in Maricopa County. And so lots of back and forth, especially in that race about election integrity generally, sort of the stop the steal rhetoric, which we'll talk a little more about what I think the impact of that really was on that race. But again, a Democrat in a position that has not been a Democrat for a while. Our attorney general, this race is actually in a recount right now, but really what the recount means is that they're making sure they counted correctly. We don't anticipate that count is actually going to change the results because there is enough of a buffer between the two that it's pretty clear. It's just to make sure, right? It's covered all of our bases. The statute says we have to do it. So Chris Mays is the new attorney general in Arizona, again, a Democrat. And was running against another Trump endorsed candidate. So all three of the candidates for governor, secretary of state, and attorney general were endorsed by former President Trump. On the Republican side, all three of them were unsuccessful.
And
So
didn't
again,
work out here this time around, huh?
not so much. Worked great in the primary, not so great in the general. And I think we'll talk about why. Superintendent of Public Instruction, y'all are in high school or teaching high school, so that one is going to be real important to you. And it's a familiar face. His name is Tom Horn. He has served as our superintendent of public instruction before, beat out the incumbent Kathy Hoffman in a race that I think probably was more indicative of what we thought we were going to see, in that this was a midterm year. Republicans do not hold any of the offices in Congress or the presidency. And so typically what you're going to see is that people are going to use this to say, hey, I'm not entirely happy with what's happening. I'm going to go vote for the Republican. I'm going to vote for the different party because I don't like what the current party is doing. That's really kind of what happened, I think, with this election. It was a turnout issue. Republicans were a little more motivated to turn out, and that's what they did. They turned out and voted here. In the treasurer's race, this is another incumbent, another Republican, Kimberly Yee, and this was one of the biggest margins in a statewide race. So she won hands down, was leading from the outset, never fell behind, versus the superintendent in public instruction. And obviously the AG's race were really, really close. And this is kind of attributed to her very moderate positions, again, being the Republican, so had sort of the wind at her back. But then also, Tom Horn has some problematic elements. There's some baggage there a little bit. And Kimberly Yee didn't have any of that. She's very well liked. She's very well loved, has been doing a great job, and kind of that paid off for her,
Kind of
right?
walks the line.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So no surprises at that one. But this is a little motley crew, right? We've got some division within the executive tower itself, and it will be very interesting to see how the priorities from those top elected officials trickle down to the elected officials that don't share their party, and what that looks like. Then we have the state legislature. And if you'd asked me 6 months ago, definitely 12 months ago, what are we going to see in this upcoming election? Me, everybody else, conventional wisdom was Republicans are not just going to keep the chambers, they're actually going to expand their majority. So we're not going to have any more of this one person majority thing. We're going to have wider margins, more of a mandate for Republicans to come in. But Katie, do those numbers
That's
there
two.
familiar?
That's two. I can count. That's two.
This is exactly the same margin we had in the last legislature. One Republican majority in the House, so 31 Republicans, 29 Democrats in the House, 16 Republicans in the Senate, 14 Democrats. So one person majority yet again. That was a surprise because we had a few things working for us. The first we did, like we already talked about, it's a midterm election where the Democrats are in control. Usually that's going to bring more Republicans and Republican enthusiasm. But also, we had redistricting, and that was playing and should have played, I think, a much bigger role in what the makeup of the state legislature was going to be, because by and large, redistricting was pretty favorable to the Republicans. It took some more competitive districts and made them a little bit deeper red. And so this was a big surprise. And there's a couple of reasons that I think we saw it. We'll talk about what few of those are, but the strategic one is that Democrats did what we call a single shot strategy in a few districts. So in the House, you vote for two people, right? And unlike the House of Representatives at the federal level where, here's your district and whatever, these two people are from the same district and they could be neighbors, like literal next door neighbors. You just elect two of them, okay? So what Democrats did was they saw more competitive districts where Democrats could have a better chance. And instead of running two people and then potentially splitting up that vote, they only ran one. So every Democrat had one person to vote for instead of two. And so that kind of bumps up that vote count just a little bit and gives that Democrat a better chance. It also means you're not sort of splitting resources, right? In terms of funding and donations and time and volunteers. So that was a really successful strategy in a few districts, in at least two districts. And I think that may have been the difference for those two. So we're dealing with both the unexpected and the status quo all at the same time.
That's wild.
It kind of is.
Do you think this is going to be like the trend that our state goes? I mean, because we kind of did not what we were anticipating. So I guess we don't really know what to anticipate anymore based on that information. But
I think that's kind of accurate. I'm going to flip to this slide on that question, and then we'll go back to the other races, because I think it really does get to, what did we learn? Is this in fact a trend in Arizona? And that's the last question on that slide, right? Are voters going to continue to moderate? Are we really becoming from what used to be pretty deep red state to a purple state? There's arguments on both sides of that. And I'm going to do the lawyer thing and just say, well, it depends. Because I don't necessarily think that this election is the best indicator, because we had so many weird things at play, right? We had a Supreme Court decision on abortion that motivated voters, I think, in ways that I definitely didn't anticipate. When that decision came down, I kind of thought, everyone knows how they feel about that issue already. Like, it's not going to change anybody's vote. I don't think it changed anyone's vote. I think it brought a lot of people to the polls who otherwise didn't really have
opposite views. Yeah. Exactly. And so wanted to make
they already knew how they felt, but they just weren't all that motivated to express how they felt until that decision came down. Gotcha. We also had the Stop the Steal kind of movement that we've been hearing really since January of 2021. The question of, are elections safe? Are they fair? Is there election integrity? That's not the same sort of, we haven't really had that question to that degree and with that level of animosity, right, in any election before. And so that was a real motivating factor for a small group of voters to go out and vote for their candidates who were sort of on the Stop the Steal side. But it was also a motivating factor for people who were just sick of it and who said, you know what, I do have faith in our elections. I feel like you're a sore loser and I'm tired of it and I want to get out of the spotlight. Exactly.
Yeah.
So between those two things, I don't know that we can really look at this election and say, we know what Arizona looks like now. But there is one thing that I think might indicate the answer to that is yes. It's not the rejecting the Republicans at the top of the ticket, because again, if you reject something that's extreme, that doesn't mean you had to moderate, right? It just means that you weren't as far on that side. You could still be a very conservative Republican and have some issues with the folks that were at the top of our ticket. But I think that Proposition 308 is the best indicator that maybe Arizona is starting to moderate in its political views. Because what Proposition 308 did was provide and guarantee in-state tuition for recipients of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So this would make sure that kids that were brought into America, into Arizona specifically, as children from Mexico who do not technically have legal status, because we're still trying to figure out what DACA means at the federal level and what we're going to do with that. But it makes sure that those students, those kids, can access in-state tuition. When you kind of juxtapose that against just about a decade ago, Arizona had passed SB 1070, right, which was a huge issue in terms of race relations and in terms of how are we treating immigrants and what do we want to do. That's quite a flip from, I think, the sentiment, at least that we had in our elected officials then, to the sentiment that our voters have now. So I'm not going to say yes, that this is the trend, that Arizona is going to see a spat of Democrat governors and Democrats in the executive tower for the next couple of years or next few elections. But I do think there are indicators that our politics on certain positions are changing, and that may be reflected in some of what we see going forward.
And if the candidates then pay attention, maybe they'll strategize a little bit more of their, on either side, how they're communicating and what their platforms are, so to speak.
That's absolutely right, because rejection of extremes, again, happened on both sides of the aisle. Absolutely. And I think we see that in our federal election results. So we just talked about the state executive tower is now basically controlled by Democrats. We didn't have a great Republican showing in the state legislature, but Republicans had a real good showing federally. So our House delegation used to be 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans. After this election, 6 Republicans, 3 Democrats. So a complete flip, a bigger margin on the Republican side. So, I mean, that's again, what we didn't want Republicans at the local level, but we did want them at the federal level. That's a really interesting sort of way to think about that. Plus, we've kept our Democrat senator, right? Mark Kelly. And that, again, on that lessons learned slide, which we'll go back to again, I think really just kind of was a rejection of an extreme for a lot of people. Or it was that candidate quality really mattered and people didn't like the other candidate. They didn't feel like he was the kind of candidate they wanted to elect, right? He didn't do well in focus groups, like that sort of thing. He just wasn't the best candidate on that side. And so Mark Kelly, who was much more of a known quantity, a lot of people, I think, didn't necessarily really, really like Kelly and wanted to vote for him, but they definitely didn't want to vote for Mr. Masters. So that's kind of where that came down. But a couple things to note on the House side. The reason that we were able to change those margins is because we had 2 seats that flipped from Democratic control to Republican control. The first was in Congressional District 2. So if you're looking at this map, that's the biggest one. It's the one in the top right corner or the northeast corner of the state. One of the biggest congressional districts in the country in terms of the land mass of the district. So props to whoever has to make sure they're taking care of all of the constituents there. But that used to be a district held by Congressman Tom O'Halloran, now held by Eli Crane. So change that from a Democrat to a Republican. Then CD6, that's the district directly south of CD2. That is the district that was currently held by Ann Kirkpatrick. Technically, we didn't flip it because Kirkpatrick did retire, so she wasn't running again. But we did flip it in that it went from being held by a Democrat to now being held by a Republican, Juan Ciscomani, who, by the way, is an AgPAC endorsed candidate. We really, really like him. We're very, very excited about Mr. Ciscomani heading to Washington on our behalf. So, again, some interesting things that we saw in this election. The 3 Democrats that kept their seats were all incumbents, and then actually the rest of the House delegation incumbents as well. So our 2 newcomers to Washington are brand new Republicans, making us a redder delegation than we were before.
That is interesting, your point of, here locally, we're kind of that purple, right? We kind of swung Democratic in the executive. And then we're very much red going to the federal. But I think that speaks a little bit to that moderate piece again, too, right? Maybe that there will be some balance, and maybe speaking more to the candidates themselves, not a Republican Democrat issue or situation, but more so the candidates, what they represent, how they present themselves, etc.
That's right. And what it does to me is kind of give me some faith in our voters too, that they really did their homework. And that they said, this is the kind of representative I want. And they waited until they found that representative, right? And you'll see that too, in that there was a lot of what we call undervoting in this election. So folks who voted for people down ticket, like their House members, like their state legislators, but didn't vote at the top of the ticket. So either for that Senate seat or for that governor's seat. So I think, to your point, Katie, it really was a candidate quality issue where people were saying, I don't like what this other person stands for, and that's not my philosophy, but I don't like what the person who is in my party is standing for either. And so I'm just not going to vote for either one of them. I'm not going to put my stamp of approval there. So again, that to me makes me feel like we've got some informed voters and some folks who are really caring about what they put down on their ballot. And that gives me hope for the future.
Me too.
So another sort of, I think it's an interesting commentary on where Arizona lies right now. And we already talked about 308, but is the results of our ballot initiatives. First of all, we had 10 of them this year. So apologies to all of you voters, because that's too many.
It was a lot.
So many to go through and to learn about. And, trying to be an informed voter can be very difficult when there's that many. But I'll highlight 4 of them. The first is the one that we are most excited about because it's the one we really, really cared about. And that was Prop 129. What that does is it requires that future ballot initiatives be limited to a single subject. So you can't deal with 3 different things in one ballot initiative. One subject, the court will decide whether that is a single subject or not. We think this is going to have a huge impact on making ballot initiatives clearer, easier to understand, and in a lot of cases, a whole lot less dangerous because we're not log rolling a bunch of bad things in with one good thing that people want to do. And therefore, they kind of hold their nose and vote for the whole thing.
That's exactly what I was thinking. When I saw this one, I thought, well, gosh, that just seems like common sense. If you want me, my opinion, my vote, my opinion on something, make it one thing. And then we go to another, because if you put 3 things in there, I might not have the same positive or negative opinion on all 3. And then you're stuck.
Only one bubble.
So yeah, I love this.
One idea per bubble, right?
One bubble.
Very, very excited about this. And just want to give a shout out to a lot of our grassroots members, like Bill Kerr from Kerr Family Farms, who let me invade their farm with a camera, and in some cases a camera and a 4-year-old, so that we could take some footage and get their thoughts on this, because I really think it was their voices that got this thing across the finish line with about a 5% margin in terms of 55 to 45. So really happy about that. I guess it's a 10% margin, actually.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's great. Prop 132 is another ballot initiative reform measure. So what this one does is it says that if you're going to pass a new tax through a ballot initiative, you can't just do 50% plus 1. You have to get 60% of the people in the state to approve a new tax. It might seem a little strange, but it's really similar to a rule we already have for our state legislature, where if they're going to approve a new tax, you have to get a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. Because what we've decided as citizens, as people, is that if it's going to cost me money, I want to really make sure that is what more than a majority of Arizonans want, but a super majority of Arizonans. And that one passed. So we really like our ballot initiative process in Arizona. We protect that very heartily, but these 2 reforms passed. So I think that's an interesting commentary on, we like direct democracy, but we want it to be fair and we want it to be consistent. So keep that up, Arizona. That's a good thing. So I already talked about Prop 308, so I won't belabor that point. But then the other one, and I think this again goes a little bit to the we're tired of the stop the steal issue, is that a ballot proposition that would have required more stringent voter ID requirements failed. So again, that sort of our elections are rigged and we need to do more about that. That message did not resonate well with voters. And I think we saw that both in who they elected and some of the things that they refused to elect as well. So then we had more ballot propositions. And 2 of them were county level. And I think we talked about them a little bit on the last webinar in terms of water. So in Cochise County, there were 2 potential active management areas that were on the ballot. So asking people, do you want to create an active management area with more water use restrictions in the basin where you live? And this was a completely mixed bag. So in the Wilcox AMA, that proposition failed. Folks in that basin did not want to create an active management area. In the Douglas AMA, which is south of the Wilcox AMA, just up against the Mexican border, that proposition passed. So those folks did decide that they wanted stricter water use regulations.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. And I think that what it shows is that we have some options available to us as citizens when it comes to regulating natural resources like water. And again, people are going to be very careful about whether they choose those options or not. And so we do have tools at our disposal. I think that's the conclusion that we can come away with this from. Whether we like the outcomes or not, the tools are there. If folks want to enact them, they can. And that gives us all the more reason to remind the legislature, hey, the tools are there. You don't need to do this on sort of a broad basis. We have the grassroots ability to kind of come in and say what we want. And they proved that in Wilcox and Douglas, both what they wanted and what they didn't want. So there we go. Very interesting. All right. So I already talked about lessons learned. I think, we've got that kind of going through the whole thing. So let's move on next to how does this impact our priorities, right? What does this actually mean for us as an organization, our members, for me as the person kind of down there at the legislature? Katie, are you familiar with before people who didn't want to adopt a New Year's resolution, so they would adopt a word of the year? This is my word of the year. And it's positivity, yes. Or it's, yes, rest or whatever. Yes. Apparently the state's word of the year is divided government, because I have heard it 7,000 times in the month of November.
I was going to say, we're just in December 1st today. So, the elections weren't that long ago.
It's the word, right? Divided government. So like we talked about, right? We've got GOP control of the legislature. We have Democratic control of our executive tower. Even at the federal level, GOP control of the U.S. House, Democratic control of the U.S. Senate and the presidency. And that's going to be true regardless of what happens in today's Georgia runoff, right? The Democrats control the Senate because they're already at 50. Vice president breaks the tie. So that's an interesting dynamic, because what you have is legislatures that lean to the right, legislatures that are probably going to want to pass some pretty right-leaning legislation. And then you have executives that have to sign that. And that's not going to work. So here's kind of what I anticipate. I think that right out of the gate, especially at the Arizona level, because at the federal level, the Senate is still held by Democrats. So the House really isn't going to be able to send the Senate anything that's overly radical or not bipartisan, and the Senate will just, rubber stamp it and put it up. But with GOP control of both houses at the Arizona legislature, I can see there being some appetite to put some stuff on the governor's desk that they know she will not sign. Because what that does is make her put her money where her mouth is, right? And say, who am I going to make mad today? Am I going to make the Republicans mad, or am I going to make my base mad? And then Republicans can use that as momentum to say, look, see, she won't do what we want her to do. I understand that strategy from a political standpoint. I understand that strategy from the standpoint of a party that wants to get more seats in the House in the next election. From the standpoint of an organization like ours, which is nonpartisan and really, really wants to get good things done,
accomplishes nothing.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of good policy out there that can be bipartisan for sure. Sometimes it's not, but a lot of the times it can be. And so it's really hard when you sort of have those dynamics clouding everything that you're trying to do, when what you're trying to do is get good policy passed. So that's going to be a challenge. And the way we overcome that challenge really is through relationships and making sure that folks on both sides of the aisle understand why what we're doing is good policy. They understand what the impact of it will be on farmers, on ranchers, on consumers, people who need to eat, which is all of us. And that takes a whole lot of work, especially when about a third of the legislature are brand new faces. They've
Good
never
luck.
done this
Good
before.
luck.
They don't know who we are. Or I mean, hopefully they know some of who we are, but for the most part, they don't know who we are or what our role is at the legislature. So in a year where it is more important than ever to build relationships and educate, we have more educating and relationship building tasks to do than ever before. So that's where we are.
Which makes our Ag Fest in January super important. Yes.
Super, super important. And if all goes according to plan, it will be January 31st. I found out 15 minutes ago. So we're good. We're good. All right. So that's kind of the general. But what about on our, major priority issues? The first of which, of course, is water. Already said, I think that there's successes in further regulation in water for rural Arizona. What I think is that shows that the local citizens can take matters into their own hands, but that means that local citizens are going to want to take matters into their own hands. And so we're going to see more and more of these attempts to establish existing regulatory structures in basins where they don't currently exist. But I also think that because that was a mixed bag, right? Because we saw a yes in one and a no in another, I don't think we're going to stop the push at the legislature for additional tools, right? More regulatory structure, mandated regulatory structure. So we're going to have to sort of fight that on both levels and say, look, we appreciate locals saying what they want. And you know what? We're going to respect their decisions. We helped inform a lot of those decisions in the Wilcox Basin, especially. But we get that. But also that means that the legislature really needs to take a long and hard look before it steps in and mandates any additional regulation. I also think that, as we talked about water, especially last year, we kind of always had this thing in the back of our mind where we have a very business-friendly governor. We have a Republican governor who is going to want smaller government and is going to do things that represent smaller government. We don't have that backstop anymore. And so that's another kind of issue too, where there would be, attempts to maybe override the will of leadership in the legislature by getting one or two Republicans to join the Democrats. But we knew that if something passed that way, the governor wasn't going to respect that and sign it.
Right.
Now we have a governor that probably
now we don't know.
Right. So that's going to be interesting. And then the other thing is a maxim that we learned and used a whole lot in law school, but it's true in politics too. And it's that bad facts make bad law. And the bad facts that we're dealing with right now is this sort of story that's out there about foreign entities stealing water, right?
Gosh, I hear that all the time.
All the time. And it's an interesting story, right? Because there's a lot to be said for things like private property rights and capitalism and the way that our economy works and wanting to bring in that economic development. What we hear, though, I think is not arguments about that and what our economy should look like. It's arguments about, well, these foreign companies are getting sweetheart deals. Okay, none of that is true. and we don't have to make any of that true to actually have a good conversation about what do we want our economy to look like and what do we want resource management to look like. But because those are that's the storyline, and because it's really easy to make that a very scary story when we hear, it's Saudi Arabia, it's China, it's all of these things that make us a little bit scared. It's easy to have a knee-jerk reaction and say, of course we need to stop that. Let's do it right now. And not think of the ramifications of that for interstate commerce and companies from other states coming in, for our ability to export agricultural products across our border, which is a huge part of our national agricultural economy and Arizona's agricultural economy. So again, all goes back to, we've got to make sure that we have those relationships with our legislators, that we can cut through those stories and cut through the noise and say, we understand why that's such a terrible talking point, but let's talk about the reality. And let's talk about how decisions we make today will impact us tomorrow and what we want that tomorrow to look like. So,
So to back up and put you on the spot there a little bit, then
yeah.
with bad facts make bad law, and you brought up the different countries who are coming in and doing a lot of alfalfa is my assumption is the direction that you were talking there. So is there little bits of information that you can provide to our students watching today that counter that? They're getting sweet deals coming in here. They're getting everything cheap and exporting things away. Are there some of those solid facts that you could just trickle to them right now, and then we could go into detail another time perhaps?
Sure. So I'll give a fact and I'll give sort of a comparison or a narrative, right? The first fact is that there's no such thing as a sweetheart deal with our state land department. State land agricultural leases are dictated in statute. The policy for those are made at the Arizona State Land Department, and you have to follow and meet certain criteria when you get one of those leases. The reason that a lease for agricultural land or a lease of state land for agricultural uses is going to be below the market rate, right? You're going to be able to go out and get a state land lease cheaper than you can go out and get a private land lease. There's a lot of reasons for that, though. One of the reasons is that the state needs those lessees to help take care of that land. We don't have the ability as a state to go and make sure that the land that we're supposed to be stewarding and that we keep in trust in order to benefit the K-12 education system, among other things, but definitely the K-12 education system, we don't have the personnel to make sure that land is being managed well. So by leasing it out to people who are keeping that land in production and who are making sure that it'll actually be worth something later on when we want to sell it to benefit the trust, we need to incentivize that. We need to incentivize people to want to do that.
And that goes to everybody, not just people from other countries, but our farm and ranch members who are doing leases, etc. I mean, that's across the board. Yeah.
We have a ton of our farmers who lease land either to grow crops on it or to ranch it. State land and ranching go hand in hand for sure. And it's the same thing. Those are going to be a below market or below private market level lease. But there are reasons for that make sense. Another one of the reasons is that if you're going to make improvements on a state land lease, you're going to drill a well, or you're going to build a fence, or you're going to improve a pipeline, you don't own that improvement. The state land department does. So you're investing all of that cash as an agricultural producer to steward that land better, to make your operation better. But at the end of the day, when the state land department decides that they're going to, stop your lease or use that for something else, which they can, you don't get to recoup the cost of that investment. And so that's another reason that there needs to be a purpose for you. You might be paying less for that, which allows you to make that investment in that property because your landlord's probably not going to help you, which is the state. And then you don't get to reap the benefit of that later on down the road. So when you hear, look at this sweetheart deal, look at how little farmers and ranchers are paying for their state land leases, there are economic realities behind why that is the case. And they not only benefit the farmer and rancher, they benefit us. They benefit us as a state to make sure that this land we have in trust that does such important things across our state can continue to function and do what it's supposed to do. So that's my fact, right? That's kind of my fact base. But then let's talk about the narrative base too of why are we exporting products outside of the United States? And sometimes it's hard for me not to sound snarky when I say this, but I'm going to say it like, that's what trade is. That's
into an economics class.
Exactly. And when you think about it, let's think about all of the other things that we export. Food is a big one, of course. We also export microchips, and we're trying to do a whole lot more of that. We export all kinds of products across the nation, right? But think about what we import. Katie, have you ever seen a banana growing in the United States?
Or a pineapple?
No, definitely not. And all of that takes water too, right? Water is something that is inherent in pretty much every product that we use, and it crosses borders as a product, as something that is valuable, right? We're turning that water into something that we can use to create wealth, to improve lives, to provide nutrition, whatever that looks like. So to say, this is an export of our water, though that is technically true, we're also importing a lot of
Importing
water
water.
too. And so we need to look at that much more holistically. I'm not saying it's a good policy. I'm not saying it's a bad policy, right? But what I'm saying is that if that's going to be your talking point, we're exporting our water. Well, you have to look at that a little more holistically too. Because
Makes
if we want
sense.
to talk about net import versus net export, given what we import into the United States, I would probably guess we're a net importer of water, just knowing how much it takes to grow a banana. So
Right.
I keep going back to bananas because I have a 4-year-old and
I was going to say, you do a lot of bananas in your
a lot
household,
of
don't you?
bananas. A lot of bananas. So that was a lot to talk about on water, but that it really is going to be where the bulk of our attention, as per usual, right? That's nothing new, but there's just a lot going on, and we have new leadership across our state who are very interested in this topic and who need to make sure that they have the agricultural perspective in front of them. And that's why I love the way Farm Bureau is structured so much, because I can go in and talk to them until I'm blue in the face. But what I get to do is bring in the actual farmers, the actual ranchers who are living these things. And when I talk about the education and relationship building, that's what I'm talking about. It's not me going into their offices and saying, "Hi, I'm Chelsea."
Making those
It's me
connections.
bringing, right.
Yeah.
It's me bringing our members, their constituents in and saying, "Hey, listen to these people, listen to their stories." There's nothing more effective than that. So you got me all on my I love Farm Bureau soapbox, Katie.
Yay.
It's a good firm.
I'm gonna
It's
get
okay.
you a sticker.
That's right. All right, so 2 more things that I promise I'll be a little bit quicker on. This is also a farm bill year. And when we have a divided US House and Senate, that bipartisan farm bill, which needs to be bipartisan, it's even more critical. But it also becomes a little bit more challenging because we have a Republican controlled House, which is not going to want or not going to be very enthusiastic about passing what will be the most expensive farm bill in the US's history, which let's just get that out of the way right now. Like that's going to be the case.
Like everything else is today.
Right. It's not our fault.
Yeah.
Just, this is what things cost, right? And this is what it costs to make sure that we have a secure food supply, that we have food secure households across America. That's just what it's going to cost. But we are going to have Republicans who are really looking at that bill as a way to cut down on quote unquote corporate welfare and a way to cut down on quote unquote normal welfare, right? Like all of it is going to be tough. Then we're going to have a Senate that I think is going to want to make a lot of changes to that bill that would make it more expensive, but maybe not necessarily on our priorities, right? It is going to be more on that nutrition assistance type of thing, which we 100% support, but that sometimes takes resources away from the crop insurance and the commodity provisions and conservation title that we really, really care about in the Farm Bill. So that's just going to be a little bit of a complicating factor. And I will also say that just close to home, one of our biggest priorities for the Farm Bill coming up is improving the depredation compensation program for the Mexican gray wolf. That's just a really fancy way
I
of
know
saying,
what that is. I was going to say, be
yeah,
English, please.
yeah, that's just a fancy way of saying making sure that ranchers get paid when a wolf kills one of their cattle. And the problem is it's not just cattle kills that make a difference, right? Yes, that's absolutely huge. And it's a big part of how the wolf impacts a cattle herd. But just having the wolf on your ranch will impact your herd regardless of whether it's killing cattle. Cattle get stressed out and then they don't have the same pregnancy rates that you want them to have. You're also paying for some of these like management measures, trying to put fencing up or trying to have like a literal range rider who's riding across the range trying to keep wolves away from your cattle. All of that costs money, and it makes it a whole lot more difficult to be profitable on a ranch when a wolf exists there. And the only reason the wolf exists there is because the federal government says it has to. So we want to take advantage of the Farm Bill to say if the federal government is mandating that this creature be on our ranches, it needs to pay for the impact that this creature has on our ranches. And we have a lot of momentum on that right now. But the bill that we're using to gain that momentum was sponsored by Mr. O'Halloran. So it's not at all dead. We had a backup plan. You know, we knew that this was a definite possibility, but it does, you know, put us back a couple of steps. And so is what it is. But again, education, relationships, all that good stuff, we're going to be just fine. Then it comes to ballot initiative reform, which you might be kind of like a little confused as to why this is such a big deal for Farm Bureau. Like I said, we worked really hard on Proposition 129. We're really excited to see that reform. And here's why, Katie. Ballot initiatives have been used as weapons against the agricultural industry for really the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I'm thinking pigs and eggs.
Eggs. I'm thinking lots and lots of animal agriculture issues. And we don't see that slowing down anytime soon, unfortunately. But what we think we can do, rather than trying to fight these things off one by one, let's make the process better. Let's make sure people actually know what they're voting for. Let's make sure out-of-state interests can't dictate what we're doing. And again, Arizona, like I said, really, really likes our direct democracy. And that's clear. And we like that. So how do we protect that process and protect our ability as citizens to direct the way that our state's going to go? But make sure we're doing that well and make sure we're doing that in reasonable ways. So we're very invested in ballot initiative reform, and I like the momentum that we're seeing, and I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to keep that going as well.
Well, I'm going to take your word for it. Optimistic. You know more than I do. But that's my word of the year, optimistic.
There you go. Now I know what Katie says.
But the year's almost over, so you never know where that's going here in another month or so. Just kidding.
Just JK.
Always optimistic, people.
I would say positive, always positive.
You gotta smile and you gotta move on because it is what it is.
It's true.
It's like kindergarten. You get what you get and you don't throw a fit. You can't change it. Just make the best of it and move along.
Get what you did.
All things in life.
But you show up at your county policy development meeting.
That's right. You're still there. I love that. Well, hey, Chelsea, as always, thank you for popping on and kind of making a little smoother the mess that we were all looking at, right? I mean, a lot of times those things pop up on the screen and you're like, okay, this person, but I don't know exactly what that actually means. So
right.
I think it puts us a little bit more on the track, and I look forward to seeing how, when the new leadership and new folks come in, how your education, relationships, and all of those things continue on to do the best for farming and ranching here in Arizona. So
we look forward to it too. And, thanks for letting me talk at you for a while. I know this is stuff that, unless you're kind of living it, sometimes it's either not interesting or not attainable, but hopefully we were able, like you said, to smooth it out a little bit and make it digestible for you guys.
Yep, makes sense. So I sure appreciate it.
Anytime.
And I look forward to seeing you next month. We're back on our track of every month. So we'll see you. Well, I'll see you before then, but in this regard, we'll see you soon. Right. All right. Thank you, friend.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.